Khoi, and this is Jesmyn Ward. And you know, it's the next to last session on our last day, and I just wanted to thank. I mean, so many faces now that I've seen multiple times, and I want to thank you for your interest and your enthusiasm, and most of all, your kindness over these last 3 days. You know, you should be applauding yourselves, but you know, no matter what your worldview is, these are very trying times we've been, and I was, over 60 years ago, JFK, President Kennedy, was giving a speech at Amherst at the dedication of the Frost Library. And so he was talking about art. And I can't remember the whole thing, which is good because we don't have that much time, but he did say, when power narrows the areas of man's concern, poetry reminds him of the diversity and richness of experience. When power corrupts, poetry cleanses. And I think with your presence here, you're all honoring the spirit of that in the love that you're showing to our authors and our artists, our poets. So thank you for being here. So Jesmyn, if I were to describe you as a storyteller of stories that matter, would that be something that would be okay with you?
Yes.
And where did that, I'm going to just turn this a little bit because it feels weird. I asked to have swivel chairs next year. Where did that storytelling tradition come from for you?
It came from two different places. The first was my grandmother, she was a storyteller. And I didn't realize it until maybe, 5 years ago, because I was thinking a lot about her and about her life because she was suffering from Alzheimer's. And so I began thinking about, who she had been to me and the fact that she helped raise me. And then I realized that one of the things that she would do often is she would just, we have this huge extended family, and she would get that extended family to gather at her house, and she would just tell stories. She'd be in the center of this group of people, and she would tell stories about her life, about her parents and their parents, and she was this amazing storyteller. She would imitate people's voices. She was actually really funny. Like, even at the same time that she was, she'd tell us these stories that were, some of them were terrifying, right? Some of them were very serious.
About people in your family.
Right, about people in my family, right. Like, so she would tell this story about, because she was one of a set of twins, right? And her twin was stillborn, right? So I remember hearing that story when I was very little, right? But so at the same time that she could tell me a story like that, or tell me a story about, about having to hide in the trunk of her father's car, right? As they were sort of riding through a sundown town,
because
right?
Of
as the sun
racial
was setting. Right, because
segregation.
Right, and my great-grandfather, her dad, he was very fair-skinned, and so he could, in a clutch, he could probably pass, right? If you sort of saw the car whizzing by, you could perhaps think that he was a white man, right? But my grandmother, she was brown-skinned, right? And her siblings, most of her siblings were also brown-skinned too. And so when they would visit relatives in this sundown town next door, the relatives would say, okay, you have to leave before the sun sets. And even though they would leave before the sun would set, she and her siblings would have to climb into the trunk of the car and hide in the trunk of the car in order to get back to
all these people that
safely.
You didn't really know, and you were hearing this.
Right.
In the I think the epigraph to, is it Sing and Buried Sing? Mm-hmm. that you have Eudora Welty. Mm-hmm. Memory is a living thing, mm-hmm. right? Memory is a living thing. Memory. That which is remembered joins and lives, and so it's like kind of bringing back, making these
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. She's really important to my understanding of the importance of story.
And you said one other source, too.
Oh, books, of course, right? Because I was a reader before I was a writer, right?
Yeah.
And reading did not come easily to me. I wasn't one of those kids whose brain was wired just so, and who would,
Who gave you books? Who got you interested in reading?
my mom tried. So my mom she bought all these, teach your child how to read, right? She bought all
You're
these
the oldest
books.
child.
I'm the oldest child, and she was like, well, you're gonna learn how to read early. I'm gonna teach you how to read. And so she would go, to her job. She was a housekeeper at a hotel up the road, but she would, work her shift, and then she would come home, and we'd sit in my grandmother's living room, and we would work our way through these workbooks, but it just didn't click for me for whatever reason. So I didn't.
Were your brothers, was Joshua and your brother and your other sisters, did they become readers as well, or was it just you?
My brother really wasn't much of a reader, but I think that he might have, I grew up in Mississippi, and so I think that he might have had learning disabilities, but he was never diagnosed, right? He was never assessed and diagnosed. But my sisters, my middle sister, she was a reader.
Yeah.
But my youngest sister, she was very much a math person, so she disliked reading.
Did you have cousins, or did you friends, or was this just something really you felt like kind of like a one of one?
Yeah, I remember. I was in the gifted program at my school, right?
This is a public school.
A public school, right? And so I learned how to read in first grade, because back then in the 80s, that's when they taught us how to read. And once I learned, I thought everyone, and then I was accepted into the gifted program in second grade. And in the gifted program, we had to do these like reading comprehension sort of exercises, right? And everyone in the class hated doing them. And I remember thinking once, oh, everyone else hates this, but I love this. Like, I love reading. It's something that I articulated to myself. And from then on, it was something that I recognized and accepted about myself, that I loved story.
Is it something you had to hide, or is it at school? Did it mark you as a no?
Well, everyone knew I was a bookworm, right?
Yeah.
And they called me a bookworm. But
Nicely.
somewhat. Somewhat.
Yeah.
When I got older in junior high, right, there was some. But junior high is hard for everybody.
But you said it was particularly hard.
Yeah.
I think. And so you end up switching schools.
And going to a predominantly white, it was a private school. So I was basically a scholarship kid, because my mom was a housekeeper for several families who sent their kids to the school. So they basically paid for me to attend the school.
Because they knew about you through your mother.
Yeah. And they knew I was a smart kid who was struggling, I guess.
What an act of incredible generosity.
Yes.
It changed your life in a way. So how was it going? Now, the other school being affluent, not too many people look like Jesmyn Ward.
Yeah, I was the only black girl in the school for a number of years. And I think there were a couple years where I was like the only person of color,
Yeah.
And that was difficult. It was a different type of, I don't know. I very much felt like an other in those spaces. Even though I was just as invested in academics and was working just as hard as everyone else, I still felt very different.
I remember one of your essays that you wrote. I think it was in the introduction to The Fire This Time. You spoke about how you and 4 or 5 of your classmates got a trip to Washington.
Yes, and so we visited. Our representative at the time was Trent Lott, and so we visited his office, and so the kids that I was with, there were like 5 or 6 of us, right? I was the only black person, and there were 2 white boys and I think 4 or 3 white girls. And Trent Lott first of all, he didn't speak to any of the girls. And he was sort of like directing all of the comments that he made to the white young men in the group, my classmates. And he had a whip on his wall. And he took the whip down and he said, he said, well, we're gonna show them how us good old boys do it. And he literally started whipping the whip, like slinging the whip around in the air. And it was so surreal to me. I just watched, and as he's like whipping this, and this is in his office, right?
Yeah.
This is in his office, like in Congress, and he's just, hee-hawing and saying this phrase that we're gonna show him how us good old boys do it, and only one of my classmates, everyone else was like very uncomfortable, but one of my classmates who was a bit more closed-minded was like loving it, and he was like giggling. And the rest of us are just like staring at him doing this, and we're sort of horrified. Yeah.
Huh. The education you got there, how would you, was it a good education?
I mean, I think it was equivalent to a solid public school education, perhaps, in a different state, right? But for the state of Mississippi, it was really good.
Yeah. You obviously did really well because you got into Stanford.
True.
And you went there, and how did that, did it feel like you were just like escaping some kind of climate of oppression when you got to Palo Alto?
It did. It did. But at the same time, it did. But I was also, I think I had internalized a lot of what I'd heard from classmates and others around me, right, about whether or not I was deserving of being accepted into Stanford.
That's like the ugly side of affirmative action, right? If you ever, that everybody assumes you're somehow less worthy.
Right. And so I internalized a lot of that, and I carried it into the classroom with me.
Did you feel that way as well?
I mean, I think knowing the caliber of education that I had, and then meeting my Stanford classmates, right, and understanding that they had a completely different, right, quality of education.
Or maybe you're honing in on a few that really, probably there's a lot of people from public schools,
right?
But there are people with extraordinary life experiences, and travel experiences, and years abroad, and all this stuff.
So I was very quiet. I was like, I was the silent person in the classroom. Even if I sat in the front, I did not say anything because I was like,
Well, I think that was a shame. But then after your years at Stanford, you decided you would go back to Duluth.
Yeah, I was very homesick. Even though I love California, not past tense, present tense, right? I love California. I was just so homesick, and so I thought, at first I thought I'll try to find a job just somewhere in the South, right? I'll try to engage in some kind of work in the South, and
not necessarily writing.
No, because I thought what I was going to do is, this is before my brother passed. I thought I will probably go to law school. That's what I thought. That's probably what I'll attempt to do with my life. And then I went home, was not able to find a job. And while I was home, trying to find work, then that's when my brother
You were in
passed
New
away.
York when he actually...
I was interviewing for a position in New York City.
So really Joshua's, his tragedy, that was like a moment of clarity for you that I need to tell the stories?
Right. Yep. Because I realized, I think, when you're young, at least this is the case with me and with most of the young people that I knew, that I grew up with. We were young and we thought that nothing bad would ever happen to us, right? It's like the folly of youth, or certain youth. And so I just thought, I don't know, I didn't think that, even though, like when I think back to my grandmother's stories, or even my mom's stories, right? I mean, they lived through some very hard things, but I don't know, we just thought that nothing bad would happen. And then my brother passed, and then I realized that I wasn't. Life was not promised to me. I could die, for any reason at any time. And so I then asked myself, what are you going to do with this time that you have that your brother hasn't, right? What are you going to do? And the immediate, reply, that voice, that intuitive voice that I heard was like, writing. You're going to write. And so then I thought, well, okay, I'm going to write. I'm going to try, right? I mean, I didn't assume that I would have any sort of success, but I thought I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to try, and I'm going to try to get an MFA program, and I'm actually going to begin to try to read like a writer and actually write. And so that's what I.
So that's when you went to Michigan.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was in New York.
Yeah.
And so some of that was happening in New York, and then I decided I went to Michigan.
And was that helpful, those years?
That was, I really believe in MFA.
Do you?
Masters in Fine Arts programs.
There was a whole, there's a paperback, there was this collection of essays a few years ago called MFA versus NYC. Do you remember?
Yes,
and it was all
that.
these essays debating, if you want to be a writer, do you just go to New York City,
right,
where you came from,
right.
or do you go to MFA, but you think MFA.
Yeah.
That's your advice to all the young writers in this room.
Yes, I mean, I think, especially for someone like me, right?
Yeah.
Who came from a sort of background where my parents couldn't help me out. I had no money. I knew enough about myself to understand that if I had to work a full-time job, that I would never wite a book.
Oh,
right?
so it's just a practical thing too,
Right.
making ends meet while you're doing it,
And
not
so
just craft skill.
Right.
Yeah.
I needed funding and I needed time.
Yeah.
Right. And I needed space. And the only way that I could access all of that is through an
I think about what it takes to write a book, and people say, I think of the 3 T's, right? Time, talent, and a topic. But you're saying treasure, also a fourth T, that you need that too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And when you wrote so you're inspired, but your muse or your motivation for writing is to tell stories. And then your first novel, you had Joshua as a name for. Wow.
Yeah, I did. So in my first novel, I named one of my characters Joshua. I felt like I, in part, was sort of writing my brother into the book and writing the life that he might have lived, right? If he hadn't been, killed by a drunk driver. Because I did that, I think that I say this too, that I often say that I feel like I failed in a way in my first book, because I loved the characters so much, because they reflected so much, because I put so much of my brother into them, that I couldn't let the story be what it wanted to be. I couldn't. Yeah. It's almost like I couldn't incorporate reality into the book.
You could have pushed Christoph off.
Right. I could have. He didn't have my brother's name. I could have gotten rid of him. But I did. I coddled the characters, I think, and so the story, it wasn't able to breathe and become what it wanted to be. So I sort of learned that lesson in the writing of my first book, because every book teaches you something, right? And I learned several things when I wrote my first book, and that was one of the lessons that I learned, right? That yes, I could love my characters, but still I had to you have to honor the realities that the characters are living, and you have to let the story become what it wants to be. So you have to let go in a way, and you have to be sort of merciless. Like, you can't spare your characters.
We were talking about Harry Potter.
We were.
And when you say that, I think of J.K. Rowling saying that when she killed, not when he died, but when she killed Fred Weasley, that she like broke down and she was crying, and then she had to like every few years she issues an apology to her readers that she killed Fred Weasley,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
Because you want to, I guess you do love your characters, and then you want to protect, and that, when I looked at the body of your work, so you mentioned Joshua and Christoph, and then there's Ash and Skeeta and Randall and her, and then the next book with Jojo and Kayla, even Annis, they're all teenagers, right? Your main characters are teenagers.
I think perhaps, I don't know, I think that I think about my teenage years, right? And I think about my brother's teenage years. I mean, he died when he was 19, right?
Yeah.
And then I think about the kind of impact and that had, like how his death echoed throughout my sister's lives. I mean, they're younger, right? So I think my middle sister she was, I think, 16 when my brother died, and then my youngest sister was 14. I mean, very young, right? And they're having to deal with this kind of loss, right? Yeah. And not only were they having to sort of live through that kind of loss, like I think I was 22, but at the same time, and I wrote about this in my memoir, right? Memoir.
Right. Yeah.
So after my brother died, eventually the drunk driver who hit him was in court, right? And my mother was also in court, and the person who killed my brother was not charged with his death. There was no manslaughter,
Wait, he was charged and acquitted, or he was never even charged?
He was never even charged. Like, he wasn't held accountable in any way for my brother's death. The only thing that he was like convicted of was leaving the scene of an accident. And that's it. That is incredible erasure, right?
Yeah.
And so, I was in my early 20s, and here my sisters, my siblings, are even younger. They're teenagers, and so they're not having to deal with this great loss and this great grief, right? And this hole in our family, and also having to deal with this kind of erasure, right? So I don't know. I think in my life, and I think about my life, and I think about my siblings' lives, and the lives of my, the kids that I grew up with, and we were all, dealing with, dealing with the most serious of life events as teenagers. And so I think that's why I write about young people and teenagers often in my work, because I think it's a reflection of what I saw the young people around me sort of living through.
Yeah.
Right?
You brought up that you wrote about this in The Men We Reaped, and there's this, I think you say, when you talk about the drunk driver, and you say, it's kind of a reflection of how society viewed the worth of Joshua, and you say that, and you were reflecting on the worth of Joshua's life, and you say, it is worth more than I can say, but there's my dilemma,
right,
because all I can do is say.
Right.
That yesterday, for those who were with Kaveh Akbar, and he was talking about that moment in the blues singer's voice where their voice cracks. Did some of you, some people, and he's saying, that's a point where the emotion is greater than actually the art can convey, right? And I think you're referring to something similar. But I'm sorry about the digression there, but I thought that was so beautiful. But when you read, as readers, whether we're reading one of your books or Harry Potter or Pippi Longstocking, but when the main character, right, is a teen, I think the way I respond is it's about vulnerability and who's going to protect this person. And if the main character is a teen, who's protecting this person? And maybe that's what you're, not just the loss of Joshua's future, but who protects them. And I was struck by in the works that you've produced so far, whether it's because of their own issues or maybe there are things that prevent it, but the protection doesn't come from the parents.
Right.
Like Josh Christoph, his parents are, one's kind of like the Sandman guy, and then the mother's kind of absent, and in Salvage the Bones, the mother died early, and the father's got his own issues.
Right.
And saying like Leonie and Michael, they're not like the parents that you sign up for. And then in the last one, Annis's mother, she would be a protector, and in a way, her spirit of her is, but she's not physically able to be. And the father, we don't even want to go there. But,
right. I
mean, but the protection comes from the siblings in all of your works.
Right. Or in sort of found family, or I don't know, the community, right? That that the protagonists create, or that they seek.
When you were growing, did you feel safe when you were a teen? Did you feel like your family's protecting you, or?
I recognized that they were trying to, that they were doing the best that they could, I think. But I think that a part of me, even though I don't think that I would have been able to articulate it at the time, but I think a part of me understood that there was only so much that they could do, maybe, to protect me, right? And I think
Did you feel like the environment was dangerous?
Yes, yeah. And I think I felt that way even more because of I don't know.
It feels like that's in your writing.
Yes, yeah. Because I don't know. I felt as if I were, in danger when I went out into the world, right? When I went outside of my community, outside of my family, extended family, right? When you have to sort of move through the world on your own. Like I definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but then but now you're a mother, and you have children to protect. No matter what you're going through, you have to.
Right.
Yeah.
I think about that all the time, especially because I've chosen to live and work in Mississippi, and there are dangers there, right? So I don't know. I mean, I think about this often, and I don't know. I don't know how long I will. I don't know. I don't know if I will remain there, because I think about my children.
There's a something called weathering, right? I don't know if people heard of weathering, but there's this theory that if you're subjected to stress, like especially racial stress, that it impacts your health. And I think we were talking that that's something that you are very aware of and you think about.
Right. And I think that it's difficult because I see it in the people around me. You know, like I see it in the health outcomes for.
It's very much in The Men We Reaped, but
Right.
even, yeah, and it comes in your fiction too. I mean, the people, it's not somewhere where people often grow old
Right.
in a healthy way.
Right. Right.
And then there's also issues that, you know, now that there's this thing called epigenetics, that if you get exposed to trauma, that trauma actually is passed down to, in a biological way, to the next generation. There's like the things that happen to methylation DNA. There's the things that get passed on, and so in a way, it's just not like what you can bear, but you worry about the next generation. And,
Right.
And so
Right.
sometimes you feel like being good and putting yourself in a safe environment. It's not just for yourself. It's not a selfish thing. It's also for
the
next
generation.
for children.
Yeah.
Wow. Sorry to bring up.
No, I mean, you know, one has to, you know, you have to bear witness to these things. You have to reckon with them. You have to sit with them.
That's what Baldwin said. You know, he's witness. He's not a spokesperson. He's a witness.
I very much feel that way. You know, I don't know. I feel a responsibility to witness.
Yeah. So now, in your work, I'm just going to shift to a little lighter thing for a minute, if that's okay with everybody. Can we talk about something more pleasant, like Roz would say? You know, you have these wonderful characters, and obviously you love your characters, but they're characters that aren't humans too, that are. And I'm thinking about, you know, China. Is like a really character. I mean, I thought China was really important. China was the pit bull in Salvage the Bones, and then you've got the Sing and Bird Sing opens with the sacrifice of a goat, and that is the goat is a character, right? I mean, and then your most recent one, you've got a bee on the cover, and when you really look beyond just the human world. I mean, yesterday you talked about the spirits, but now there are kind of spirits in these animals too.
Yeah, I don't know. When I discovered the characters who would be central to Salvage the Bones, I began to, I don't know, gravitate towards that world and that time and those characters. The first characters who came to me, of the main characters, it was Skeeta, right, Esh's brother, and then China, his pit bull. I was in a imitations class at Michigan when we were attempting to imitate the greats, right? So we were reading Faulkner and Hemingway and Virginia Woolf, and then we had to attempt to imitate their writing.
That's
style.
like people in painting classes going to the museums. You obviously these students.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And all of us would fail miserably every week. But
You couldn't do Hemingway every
no,
week.
right.
I get to do short sentences.
Right.
Yeah.
But so we would hand in these just short fiction pieces, right? They weren't complete short stories. And so I started writing this piece, this very short piece, and I think we were studying Faulkner that week, right? And so there was Skeeta, and there was his pit bull, and they were standing in the middle of the street in Bois Sauvage, and the pit bull, the dog, was like very much like she had a presence, and there was like character there, and she had characteristics like from the beginning. And so when I dove into Salvage the Bones and started writing Salvage the Bones, like there was no question for me that she was an individual, right? She wasn't human, but she still had defining characteristics. She still had, there's certain things motivating her. She still had a will, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I feel like whenever I incorporate animals and then incorporate sort of spirits into my work, like I think about them in that same way, right? To me, each of them should have, they should have certain motivations. They should have wants and desires and needs, and they should be complicated in the same way that human beings are complicated.
And they help carry the narrative.
Right.
And your father had raised pit bull.
He did. He did.
And one of them did some damage to you.
Right. Yeah. My dad. So when I was 6, my dad had a pit bull that he hadn't raised it. He bought it as I don't think it was fully an adult dog, but it was older, right? He hadn't raised it from a puppy. And so most of the pit bulls that he raised, he got them when they were puppies, and and he had them all the way through. And they were, they call pit bulls like the babysitter dogs, and it's true. Like I remember being 5 years old and sitting out in the yard and being sad and crying, and the dogs would surround me.
I've never referred to pit bull as a babysitter.
No, I've heard them referred to as babysitter dogs. They would surround me, and they would lick the tears off my face, and they would comfort me. Like I remember that when I was a kid. So they would always take care of me. But this particular dog, my dad didn't raise it, and so I guess I was a stranger to it. And on this particular day, I was 6 years old. On this particular day, I was outside playing. This is in rural Mississippi, right? So there's no such thing as like a helicopter. My mom, I don't know what, she was probably working, right? And so I was just outside with my cousin, and we were out in this field with the dogs. And evidently there was a dog that was in heat, right? And so this male dog that my father had just gotten was probably interested in the dog that was in heat. And he was acting territorial, I guess, with the dog that was in heat. And I was 6 years old, so I didn't understand. Well, I didn't understand what was going on. I just knew that he was acting weird, and I wanted him to get away from me, right? And so I hit him on his back, and he attacked me. He leapt onto me, and those dogs, when they're trained to fight, they're trained to go for the neck, right?
Yeah.
For the necks of the other dog.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, so
that
that's what the dog attempted to do. He was trying to rip out my throat, and I I guess I panicked, and just on instinct, I was, of course, flailing and trying to get him off of me and fighting him, right? And probably was like curled up like this so that he wasn't able to get to my throat, but he ripped off part of my ear. There were like several bites in my head and also on my back. And then one of my aunts heard the commotion and came running outside with a broom and like beat him off of me and chased him away. And then I went to the to the hospital, and they had to sew my ear back on, and
I'm sorry we got.
I don't have the best. Sorry. It's like,
let's talk about bees.
Right. I don't have the best background with. I'm still a little afraid, even with little dogs.
Yeah.
Like if they're in any way like territorial or aggressive, it makes me scared.
So when I found out about this story, I thought China is really interesting that you decided you can put China in there, make China so sympathetic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But bees now, help us with bees.
I wanted, so Annis is the enslaved girl who's at the center of Let Us Descend, right? And I just wanted her to have, I wanted her character to be complicated, right? And so she loves language, and she hides, by the door and sort of listens to the lessons that her half-sisters are having with their tutor, and and her mom teaches her how to fight, and her mom also teaches her how to gather.
Half-sisters because her father is the white slave owner.
Right.
That's in the half-sisters.
Right.
They're the white girls.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And so part of what I did to try to complicate her is that I just wanted her to have something that was just her own, right? And so I thought, why can't it be bees, right? So why can't she, I don't know, sort of have this fondness for bees and beekeeping?
Yeah. I guess it must be like one of the dilemmas writing about an enslaved person is like giving them agency.
Right. Because you want to give them texture, right? I mean, because they're complicated. They're human beings just like everybody else. But I think that we have such, I think, resistance to that, because it's so hard for us to think past our lives and our experience and to sort of sit with this idea and this reality that a person could have been stripped of
all physical agency,
right? That's so hard.
Right.
It's so hard for us to inhabit that space. And so I felt like complicating her as much as I could and making her, like giving her different characteristics.
And other kinds of agency.
Right, and other kinds of agency, right? Because she
Yeah.
has agency of memory. She has a sort of imaginative agency. She has spiritual agency because she's able to, sort of communicate with this sort of spiritual world.
Yeah.
But that's something that
Yeah.
I sort of figured out as I wrote my way into the book, right? That even though she was bound physically, she could have different types of agency.
Because usually fiction, I guess you create a really interesting character, right? And then you put them in situations and see what they do.
Right.
And then if you say, well, you can't do.
Right, anything, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it took me a long time to figure that out, right? And I think that's why Let Us Ascend it took me around 8 years to write, and that's part of the reason why. Because in the classroom, I'd always been trained to think about character and think about plot in that way, right? Plot comes from the character. Put them in a situation, see how they act, or choose not to act, or But they always have physical agencies. So
right. You say you don't always plot out how it's going to go, right? You create the character, and then you create the situation, and you kind of see what happens.
Yep. Right. Which is that's how I write fiction. I actually envy novelists who can work from detailed outlines. Like, that must be nice to have that kind of clarity throughout the entire process.
I think John Irving said he knows exactly where it's going.
But for me, I don't.
How much do you know about the character at the beginning? Do you say, or that kind of evolves too as a situation?
That evolves.
Yeah.
I figure it out. Like, it's almost as if they reveal themselves to me as I write my way into the story.
Okay. I think Annis and Esh, Jojo, these are like such voluptuous names. I mean, and it's like when you bestow a name, it's an act. It's like when we have our children, our first act of love for a child is we give the child a name, right?
Right.
And in your last book, Let's Ascend, there are a number of people who don't have names.
Right. Yep. None of the white people have names. Probably a little more than halfway through the book, I realized that that was not a conscious choice, but that was a choice that I was making.
A choice you make, or is that you just like, oh, I didn't do that, or is something that you say, okay, this is what it's going to be.
Right. Yeah. This is what it's going to be. I was like, oh, because I think that I felt like that I wanted Annis, and I wanted her mother, and I wanted, the other enslaved people who she encounters and who she develops relationships with. I wanted them to be centered in a way that I feel like they often are not centered, right, in story. And so that was a way, I think, for me to center them.
The spotlight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, I was a little more than halfway into the rough draft, and I was like, okay, so this is what I'm doing. But it's not that the white characters that they're not like realized as people, that they're not complicated, because they are complicated, right? They have texture. They're unpredictable. They do things that, you don't necessarily expect them to do, right? So they have texture, they have character, they just don't have names.
And I really apologize because I screwed up and we ran out of time.
Uh-oh.
So I feel like we need to move this outside and like sit around in a big circle and continue this. But thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
It's really